So today our focus is on human external respiration, what we'd probably call the respiratory system. So we'll focus on parts, how the human respiratory system functions, some diseases of the respiratory system, and that'll finish things out for us. So yesterday we just talked briefly about sort of overall the lungs. We'll talk more specifically here today. So we obviously breathe in and out. You can breathe through your nose or through your mouth, okay? And they both lead into the same tubes, which bring that air into our lungs. And what we call sort of the nasal cavity, the area in sort of your head where this air travels through. And the nasal cavity itself, okay, which you see up here, okay, it's actually filled with hairs and cilia, mucus, that has a function. Okay, your nose hairs and snot. It has a purpose. What is its purpose?
To filter dust, bacteria.
To take stuff out of the air. As you breathe in air, okay, there's lots of different things that you're inhaling besides the gases in the air. There's dust particles, okay, things like that. There may be allergens. There may be bacteria and other things in the air you breathe in. And so some of that solid particulate matter gets filtered out by nose hairs, by mucus, where it gets trapped. Okay? And so as that air travels through the nasal cavity, then travels into what we call the pharynx, which is basically like the throat area.
Mr. Ross, so that means it's like safer to breathe through your nose than your mouth?
Yeah, it is. By breathing through your mouth, you bypass some of that filtering capacity of the nasal cavity. So yeah, really it is better to breathe through your nose because, again, some of that filtering happens there. But then that air travels down into the pharynx, which is what it also where the when we breathe through our mouth also leads there. And there's various sections of the pharynx, but you could think of it as sort of the throat. Okay. In our throat, we also have some other things going on there. We have your tonsils, okay, and adenoids. Those are lymphatic tissue. Okay. So we have a lot of this sort of lymphoid tissue that helps. There's it's kind of like lymph nodes and so forth. And so this tissue helps to, let's go back, helps to redistribute that. It's filled with lymph nodes and things for filtering out bacteria and pathogens. Some people have larger tonsils than others. My oldest daughter, when she was young, she would always snore really loud when she slept. She got strep throat, I don't know, several times a year, every year. And if she was sick or she had a cold, her tonsils would swell up so much that when she opened her mouth, you could see her tonsils there, and they're, constricting much of the airflow into her throat. Eventually, she had her tonsils and adenoids removed. So sometimes people that get like recurrent strep throat infections, they may remove the tonsils. Basically, they cut them or burn them out in a quick surgery that takes only a little bit of time, and that opens up that pharynx and allows for air to pass through better. After she had that surgery, she never snored anymore. So that's something that happens once in a while. It used to be very, very common. It's no longer as common today as it was. Also, as we travel down through the trachea, you have the larynx, okay? You have the voice box, your vocal cords, which allow you to talk. As air passes over the vocal cords, we have control over those, and we can make various ranges of sounds and so forth. And that allows us to talk. And then that leads down into the trachea. The trachea you might call the windpipe. Okay? And your trachea is there. It's in the front of your throat. It's in front of the esophagus. So obviously you have two separate tubes moving down your neck. Esophagus for swallowing food into your stomach, and the trachea for inhaling air into your lungs. it's reinforced with rings of cartilage that keep it strong. Because obviously a collapsed windpipe is damaged, crushed, restricts the flow of air into the lungs and can be dangerous. So it's reinforced with these rings of cartilage. Along the way, it's also lined with mucus and cilia to, again, filter particles out of the air that we breathe in. The top of the trachea, okay, so you see here, we have our trachea. The top of the trachea is covered with a little flap, okay, called the epiglottis. And this flap, when you swallow, this flap closes so that food particles don't end up going down your trachea. Now, sometimes it doesn't coordinate properly, and sometimes you do. You might, be drinking something, and some of it you inhale, and you start coughing, right? Coughing is an adaptation to expelling things that shouldn't be in the trachea. So we cough to get rid of that. So you start coughing up that water. You get food stuck in it. Okay, if that food gets lodged there, that's what choking is. Some piece of something gets trapped in the trachea at some point, and you can't get air in. And so, by doing the Heimlich maneuver or by hitting somebody in the back, that fork could cause them to expel that object so that they're no longer choking.
Because I remember a time.
So that trachea travels down all the way until it then branches off. So the trachea is a single tube coming down through our neck, and then in the chest it splits into two branches. One that's going to form the right lung, one that's going to form the left lung. Those branches are called the bronchi. And then those two main branches branch again, and they branch again. Again, it's like a tree. Each time it branches, these tubes get smaller. Okay? And those smaller branches off of the bronchi are called bronchioles. Kind of like venules or arterioles. Okay? Just this is a smaller branch off of the bronchi. So these would be the bronchioles. And this continues, they branch and they branch, you get smaller and smaller until they basically end. It becomes a dead end at the end of these tiny little bronchioles. And at the end, okay, it doesn't just end in a tube, it ends in a cluster of cells that we call the alveoli. Now once these branches get smaller in these bronchioles, there's no cartilage, they're not reinforced. Okay, there's no cilia anymore. That air has been filtered fully, and the bronchioles are inside of our chest, so they don't quite need the protection that the other parts of the respiratory system do. So then at the end of these bronchioles, we have these air sacs. Again, they look like clusters of grapes or something, or like a head of broccoli, where there's all these tiny little air sacs called alveoli. And this is the respiratory surface of humans. So remember, this term respiratory surface, it's the boundary between where oxygen is going to be transferred from the air into our bodies. So our lungs have hundreds of millions of alveoli that make up the lung tissue itself. So again, don't think of your lung as just like a hollow balloon. It's a cluster, it's a spongy cluster of millions of these little alveoli. It's more like a sponge than sort of a balloon. Okay. And so this is what the alveoli sort of look like. So this would be a bronchiole that leads into this alveoli. So air comes in and inflates those alveoli with air from the outside. At that time, oxygen from the air we breathed in can diffuse very, very thin. Okay? Oxygen can easily diffuse through that into our blood. At the same time, carbon dioxide is diffusing through that surface of the alveoli into the air they're filled up with, and that's what we exhale. So this is happening by diffusion because the air we breathe in has a higher concentration of oxygen okay, than our blood, and so diffusion happens. And so those alveoli fill up with air for the diffusion back and forth. The alveoli, our lungs themselves, don't have muscle tissue. They don't expand and contract on their own. We need an accessory muscle called the diaphragm that actually is what allows us to breathe in and out. So your diaphragm is tucked sort of underneath your rib cage. So if you imagine your rib cage in the skeleton, there's a muscle that sort of lies below that rib cage, sort of tucked into it. It separates what we call thoracic cavity, where your heart and lungs are, from the abdominal cavity, which is below it, which is where your digestive organs, kidneys, and reproductive organs are. So that boundary between those two is the diaphragm. And the diaphragm, it's a muscle like any other muscle. It's a sheet-like muscle, though. And it can contract and it can relax. Okay? And that process is what allows us to breathe in and out. So when our diaphragm contracts, okay, it sort of drops down, it lowers. Okay? What that does is it creates an area of low pressure. Okay? And so there's low pressure as it contracts. There's low pressure in our thoracic cavity, higher atmospheric pressure, and so the pressure forces air into our lungs. Okay? And so our lungs inflate with air as we contract that diaphragm. Once that diaphragm then relaxes, then the pressure difference changes, okay? And then we exhale that air. So by contracting and relaxing that, that's how we breathe in and how we breathe out. Sometimes that diaphragm gets temporarily stunned, okay, like a blow to the back, fall, can stun the diaphragm. And what does that cause?
Hiccups.
Not quite. Hiccups are like a spasm. It's getting the wind knocked out of you. If you ever fell or got hit with a ball or something and you got the wind knocked out of you, it just means for a few seconds your diaphragm wasn't working. You couldn't consciously breathe in and out. Okay? And it's scary and you feel like you can't breathe, but it goes away after a few seconds. It just sort of gets stunned and it's not working.
No, what about this, when I'm watching my little sister cry, or I'm crying, a minute you can't breathe for a second?
Yeah, there's
What
lots,
is that?
I don't know, there's lots of things. This morning, it was super windy. I was walking to the gym and it was wind was blowing in my face, and you ever have that feeling where the wind's really blowing, it's hard to breathe? Or if you're like a baby or something, if you blow in their face, they all of a sudden can't catch their breath and they're freak out. Do not try that at home.
My dad was there that, so
What made you think I'm just gonna blow it till
I don't know. It's just funny to watch sometimes.
That would be really cute though.
It's cute. Yeah.
Oh, it's cute.
So
No, it's
I'm
cute.
going to do it for an extended period of time.
You would kill the baby.
No, it's just temporary. Yeah, maybe that's what happened.
Babies are so cute.
And there are things like hyperventilating, okay, or stressful situations, or being scared, or being anxious. All these things can, because our breathing rates are controlled both autonomously and also consciously. And so we can control our breathing if we think about it. You're right now, because I just said it, and you're thinking about it, you have to breathe in and out, and you have to think of it, and then it feels weird, but then once you stop focusing on it, then you just breathe on your own. It becomes involuntary. Your brain just allows you to breathe in and out, and you don't think about it. So that
Whenever I don't think about it, I feel like I'm forgetting.
yeah. So it's going to work in either way. And our rate of breathing, obviously it varies. And it varies based on lots of different things. One of the main feedback mechanisms is the amount of carbon dioxide in our blood. Okay. So obviously, if the carbon dioxide level in our blood is increasing, what happens to our rate of respiration? Yeah, it picks up. We need to get rid of that excess carbon dioxide so we breathe more quickly. Okay? But there are many other input factors that feed into our respiratory rate, all of which can affect how quickly we breathe in and out. They're called a part of our brain, okay? It's in the medulla oblongata, takes input from various factors and incorporates that input to determine what our respiratory rate is going to be. Okay? So carbon dioxide levels are one of the main ones. We know from what we studied, as when carbon dioxide dissolves in water, do you know what it forms? So carbonic acid, okay, a mild acid, a relatively weak acid, okay, but it changes the pH of our blood. A buildup of carbon dioxide in our blood decreases the pH, increases the acidity of our blood, and our brain responds to that. That's how it knows that carbon dioxide levels are getting too high. Okay, so that increased acidity, that increased carbon dioxide increases respiratory rate. But there are other factors, okay? Our lungs, expanding, contracting, feed into this. How much our muscles are working feed into this. We have receptors that can measure carbon dioxide levels in our aorta as our blood is passing through. Okay? We have other receptors attached to things like pain or emotion. So those sort of mental things I was just talking about, they feed into our respiratory rate. Okay? So all of these things are involved to determine what our respiratory rate. This diagram here is a little bit simpler. Okay? Talks about some of the nerve signals that come from our muscles. Okay? Carbon dioxide, oxygen sensors in the aorta, nerve signals, and all of this gets integrated by our brain to determine how quickly we need to breathe. Sophia?
Why is when someone's drowning, they usually have like
I mean, so if a person drowns, obviously they've inhaled water. That's what drowning is. And so, you know, we watched that video yesterday. You weren't here, of a guy holding his breath for 22 minutes underwater. But, you know, your brain, you can't hold your breath. And you eventually will inhale. Your brain will take over, and your sort of survival instincts just cause you to inhale. If you happen to be in the water when that happens, then you drown. And so if you're outside, if you hold your breath outside in just the air, eventually you might pass out, but then you're going to start inhaling again and be able to get the oxygen that you need. But when you don't have enough oxygen, yeah, your body sort of starts shutting down, your muscles convulse, and it eventually forces you to breathe in. So we know that we breathe in and out for gas exchange, to take in oxygen, to release carbon dioxide. So we've talked about our blood when we talked about transport. Where is the oxygen in our blood carried? Yeah, in our red blood cells by the hemoglobin molecule. How about carbon dioxide?
Plasma.
What's that? Mostly plasma. Is some carried in red blood cells? Remember the percent?
20.
20%. About 20% red blood cell, but most 80% or so in the plasma. All right, so we know that hemoglobin is important. Hemoglobin is found in our red blood cells. Hemoglobin is a pigment, a respiratory pigment that binds to oxygen to transport it. Okay, and so when hemoglobin, and the abbreviation we use for hemoglobin is often HB. Okay, so when oxygen combines with hemoglobin, it changes. It turns into oxyhemoglobin. Oxyhemoglobin is very bright red. That's why oxygenated blood is a bright red color. What color is blood without oxygen?
Dark red.
Purple.
Not blue.
Dark red.
So we draw it in blue all the time. And many people have the misconception that deoxygenated blood is actually blue. It's not really. It's darker. It may be considered purple. This is oxygenated blood. This is deoxygenated blood.
Is that the guy?
It's, I guess, purplish, dark red, but it does change color. But it's not actually blue. Okay?
It's purple.
So carbon dioxide, okay, can also combine with hemoglobin. So oxygen combines with hemoglobin, forms oxyhemoglobin. Carbon dioxide, okay, also can combine with hemoglobin to form carboxyl hemoglobin. And that's a duller red. It's that darker purplish color. We also know that most carbon dioxide is in the plasma. About 10% is just directly dissolved in the plasma itself. The rest of it, most of that carbon dioxide, 70%, forms carbonic acid. Okay? So when we combine carbon dioxide and water, forms carbonic acid, which can then release hydrogen ions, which is what makes it acidic. So we know hydrogen ions are what acidity is really measuring. So our blood becomes more acidic the more carbon dioxide that we have. So for example, if you hold your breath, okay, levels of carbon dioxide rise. Carbon dioxide forms carbonic acid, okay, and the pH sensors detect that, okay, and they increase our respiration rate. Again, this showing same sort of thing. Now, have you heard in your house, you probably have a carbon monoxide sensor. You know where those are in your house? Looks like a smoke detector. But it's not detecting smoke, it's detecting carbon monoxide. Why are those important? You don't know anything about carbon monoxide?
Well, I think, okay, I'm not 100% sure,
Okay.
but I think one time it went off my house by accident at like 2 in the morning, so like the fire
Could be.
department had to come.
Like a malfunction? So you could have carbon monoxide leak in your house from a furnace or a hot water heater that's not properly vented. Carbon monoxide is one of the products of combustion. So in your house, you have to burn fuel to heat your house. And so sometimes if that carbon monoxide is building up in your house, it can lead to a dangerous situation. Because carbon monoxide is an odorless gas that you wouldn't know that it's there unless you have a carbon monoxide sensor. And the dangerous thing about carbon monoxide, okay, is that it bonds to hemoglobin. In fact, it forms a very strong bond with hemoglobin, much stronger than the bond of oxygen in hemoglobin. So basically, if you are inhaling significant amounts of carbon monoxide, it's taking the place of oxygen on your red blood cells. And it stays on your red blood cells much longer, and therefore you're not able to get as much oxygen to your various body cells.
How would, like, if that happened and, like, say the fire department and the ambulance came, how would they?
They get you out of the house, get you fresh air.
Yeah.
Over time, that carbon monoxide is given up, and you get new oxygen in those blood cells. But if it's like a small leak, sometimes people die from carbon monoxide poisoning. Okay, they don't know, and there's a large amount of carbon dioxide in the house. They could be sleeping, get too much into their blood, and they can die from that. Sometimes also people go through, if they have like lower levels, they may be constantly tired or fatigued or feel bad. And again, that makes sense if you think about what's happening is because their blood cells are not carrying, it's similar to the effects of anemia. And their blood cells are not carrying enough oxygen because much of it is being displaced by carbon monoxide.
What about when someone's, like, in a closed garage and the car is going? What is that?
So that you have a combination of, so that's, again, buildup of carbon monoxide. Because as carbon monoxide builds up, it's the same sort of process, carbon monoxide poisoning. But there's also things like if you ever are camping and you are cooking on like one of those little stoves, you shouldn't do it in an enclosed place. Not just for carbon monoxide, but more importantly, as you're burning that fuel, that's taking oxygen out of the air. And so if you're in an enclosed, sealed up area and you're burning oxygen, that's less oxygen that's going to be present for you to breathe. Okay, lots of different malfunctions of the respiratory system that you're probably familiar with. How many people have had bronchitis before?
Right now.
So the name comes from what? Why is it called bronchitis? Yeah, from the bronchi. It is an infection in which you have fluid that builds up. The bronchi become inflamed. That mucus collects. Bacteria can invade. It's basically like an infection in the lungs. Okay, in the bronchi, those tubes. And what if you have bronchitis? What are the symptoms? You know?
It's more difficult to
Hard to breathe. Coughing all the time. Right? Again, and that makes sense that you're coughing all the time because your body's trying to expel that mucus that's built up. Asthma, very common. So asthma is caused by restriction of those airways. Okay? That the airways that lead in our lung, those bronchioles, okay? Typically they're sort of wide open. They allow a lot of air into the lungs. But a person with asthma has a reaction in which those airways sort of close up, they constrict. And therefore, a person can't get the proper amount of air into their lungs. An asthma attack is the sort of severe constriction of those that a person feels like they almost can't breathe at all. Okay, that the muscle within those airways tightens up and constricts them. Okay? And asthma can be triggered, it's genetic sometimes. People just are born with asthma. It can be triggered by environmental contaminants, dust and smog and things can induce an asthma attack. Exercise induced asthma sometimes. As people exercise, they feel the effects of that. Stress and so forth. All of these things can instigate an asthma attack. And it's treated with bronchodilators, which the name should make sense. That's what an inhaler is, a bronchodilator that sort of opens up those airways. Okay? It's usually a steroid that allows those muscles to relax, reduces the inflammation. And you have different types of medications. You have daily inhalers that a person's supposed to take every single morning to help keep their airways clean, or smooth and open. And then there are the inhalers, rescue inhalers, which are different medications that you take when you're having an asthma attack, or maybe you take before gym class or before a sport to be sure that you don't have an asthma attack while you're playing. So that inflammation, that constriction is what asthma is. And probably many of you have had tests for asthma and so forth. Tests for respiratory function, they use a spirometer is one thing, a tube like this. They have, my daughter who had asthma, they used to use this little peak flow meter. And they have to blow on as hard as you can, and you see how high you can move the little marker. And that's testing how much air you can expel and how open your airways are. They have other tests where you have to inhale as deeply as possible to see what your lung input is. So there's various ways of measuring our lung capacity. Pneumonia. Again, most of these are inflammation issues. Inflammation of the lung tissue. When mucus is accumulating in the actual alveoli, and that reduces the respiratory surface. There's less area. And it can be caused by an infection by virus or bacteria. Heart failure, people that have heart failure often can end up with pneumonia. Okay, and you can see here, you have the buildup of that fluid and mucus in the lungs. There's also a lung disease, a genetic lung disease called cystic fibrosis. You've ever heard of that? Sometimes abbreviated CF. Cystic fibrosis is a genetic mutation which leads to the mucus that is supposed to be produced in your lungs being produced, but it's too thick. And it builds up. It leads to repeated infection. And there's no real cure for it right now. A friend of mine from high school, she died of cystic fibrosis when she was about 23 years old. And the treatments have gotten better so that the life expectancy of a person with cystic fibrosis has increased, but it's still, there's no cure for it. Last couple, emphysema. Emphysema is when the alveoli sort of got stretched out and lost their elasticity, and they look more like this than they do like this. And that can be caused by environmental contaminants, often caused by smoking, and it's basically irreversible loss of the respiratory surface. And then finally, cancer. We know that cancer can affect any part of the body. Lung cancer is one of the most common forms of cancer. Smoking obviously is a huge risk factor for lung cancer, but people can get lung cancer that haven't ever smoked before. And any type of cancer is basically the cells, our own body cells, are growing and dividing uncontrollably. There's no check on them, and this forms tumors, which can interfere with the function of our body. Chewing tobacco is a major risk factor for mouth and throat cancer, because tobacco and the ingredients in tobacco products are risk factors that increase the chance of developing cancer. Asbestos, you may have heard of. Radon gas, these are all chemicals that could result in higher risk of cancer. All right, any questions about any of those things?